Hello everyone, welcome to this month's video. This time we're going to be painting the snowy robin scene. So as always, if you want to get started by just masking the edges of your paper to make a nice neat border. I've actually just printed this directly onto the watercolour paper. You'll find the attachment of the line drawing on the Patreon. And I've actually just turned the opacity down a little bit so that comes out a nice light grey colour, just so that we don't have any sharp black lines when we've finished the painting. It's worth mentioning that sometimes when you're painting over this, once you touch it with water, the lines will start to disappear a little bit, so it's probably a good idea before you get started to just use a pencil and kind of trace over any of the important details, so maybe like the eye, the beak, the edge of the wings, that type of thing. And then once you've done that, we're pretty much ready to start painting. So the first thing that we need to do for this painting is to use some masking fluid and just to cover those areas where the snow is on the branch. And that'll just protect those bits and keep those bits nice and blank while we paint everything else. I've also dotted around a little bit of this masking fluid as well, just to kind of look like little snowflakes falling down. Don't worry about going overboard with these, because we can actually just use a white fine liner pen at the end and add some more in if you want any more. So once you're happy with how much of the masking fluid you've got on there, you can go ahead and get this dry with a hairdryer. Just make sure that this is fully dry before we start painting that background. And also the brush that you've just used to put that masking fluid on, just make sure that you give that a really good clean. If you let that dry on the brush, it dries like glue, so you'll pretty much just ruin that brush. So yeah, just make sure you give that a really good clean. And then for the background on this one, I didn't want it to be like a really bright blue, I kind of wanted this more subtle like grey blue tone. So I'm just mixing that up in the palette now. And to do that, I'm just using the blue concentrate with a tiny bit of that dark brown and a fair bit of water. And you can just test that on your little bit of scrap paper until you're happy with the colour. And so to do the background, we'll start by just wetting the page. You'll notice in this video that I haven't wet right up to the edges. I thought it'd look nice to leave like a little bit of negative space in there as well. So I'm just carefully wetting right up to the edge of the bird, sort of in between its tail, around its legs, etc. And that should stay wet for quite a while, so that'll give us a chance to kind of build up these background colours. So once you've finished wetting right up to the edges of the bird, we can start dropping in this background colour that we've mixed up. So you can see here that I'm just always continually adding more paint to that palette just to get that to the right strength that I want. And I'm just kind of going to start by dotting around this base colour, making sure that I get right up to the edges of the bird so it's a nice sharp edge. And what we'll do is we'll just build this up until we're happy with it. Now you don't have to worry about getting any of this colour where the snow should be on the branch because we put that masking fluid there earlier, so we don't have to care about that. And I'm just kind of using this dotting technique with the brush because the page is already wet, so that paint is just going to naturally spread around and it'll give us a nice soft background. Just getting right up to the edges of the tail, right up to the edge of the branch. Just adding a little bit more blue now to make this a little bit stronger. So I'm getting that blue right up to the edge of that underside of the branch and right up to the edge of the bird's body on his back there. So you can see that all the time while this paper is still wet that these colours are just blending together nicely. If you do find that one area of your page is drying out a little bit faster than everywhere else, if you just clean your brush and just use some clean water, just a little bit, and then you can just kind of blend these colours out to give it that nice soft look. So now I've kind of got the base on there and the page is still wet. I'm going to add a little bit of that stronger colour, so I've just grabbed a little bit more blue from the palette and I'm just kind of dotting that around. So what I'm trying to do is make it look balanced. I don't obviously want one area to be really blue and then the top bit to be really light, so I'm just carefully trying to balance that out. I also added a couple of little splatters as well. I thought that might look nice. You can do that if you like. I would just try and avoid getting those on the bird's body. So we can just keep building up this background, keep adding more pigment to that page until you're happy with the strength of it. Just bear in mind that obviously when this dries, it always dries a little bit lighter than it looks when it's wet. So I went pretty strong on the background. And I'll just give it a nice contrast as well when we've painted the bird. So these bits that I'm imagining now are like a much more concentrated blue. So yeah, once you're happy with the background, you can go ahead and get that nice and dry. And make sure all that background layer is totally dry before we start painting the next part. So here I'm just using a pencil just to go over those little fine details that I don't want to lose once we start painting the bird. So if you haven't done that already, yeah, I would recommend just going back and just maybe just tracing around the eye, the beak, the edge of the wing, anything that you don't want to lose once we start the painting. You don't have to press on too hard, just some nice light pencil lines should be fine. So we'll start with the red part of the robin, and to do this we'll just start by wetting that area with some clean water. So I'm just carefully working my way around his eye and his beak. I don't want to get any red paint in those parts. So we'll just wet all his chest to start with, using a slightly smaller brush than what we did for the background, but nothing too small so that we can just apply paint and water to this whole area without any of it drying out too fast. So the main colour that we're going to use for this is the cadmium red, the light red, and we're basically just going to fill that whole area with a nice light base coat of that colour. And because it's already wet, that colour's just going to spread out and blend quite nicely. So what we'll do is we'll just build up on this layer that we've already got. So now you can see that I'm adding a little bit of brown, like a reddy brown colour, to that cadmium red, just to make that a little bit deeper. And then I'm going to look at my reference and just keep checking where those dark areas are, like the shadow underneath his beak on the left hand side and sort of on his chest. Again, it sort of starts on the left. And we're just going to start building up those dark areas now, blending those together while it's still wet. You can also add a little bit of yellow to that cadmium red as well for those lighter areas that look more orangey in your reference. And you can see here that the direction of the brush strokes that I'm putting in now, I'm trying to follow sort of the pattern, the direction that its feathers would be growing. Just starting to build up a little bit of texture on this first layer. So once you're happy that you've got that first layer down and you've got your sort of main colour in there, you can go ahead and get that totally dry. So now we'll switch to a slightly finer brush for this next part. And we're basically going to be using the same colour again, but this time we're just kind of deepening those shadows, adding a little bit of texture. And you can see that by using this finer brush we're starting to add some sort of lines in there that will look like the feathers. And just keep checking that reference, just keep looking at where the dark areas are and the light areas. So I'm looking at my reference and really looking at where the lighter tones are around the eye, you know, on the top part of its chest. And so I've just made a lighter version of this colour by adding a little bit of yellow to that cadmium red. And I'm using this fine brush now just to kind of paint those areas in. Going to work my way around that whole area until I'm happy with those colours. And you can do as many layers as you like on this until you're happy with it. And I'll keep switching back, adding more of that darker red, just looking anywhere that there's shadows. I'll keep building up those areas until it sort of resembles that reference photo. So remember, it's add dark brown to cadmium red if you want that deeper red, and add yellow if you want that sort of lighter reddy orange colour. So I just dried that, and now I'm adding a final layer, just really sharpening everything up, especially that left hand side, the edge of the robin. I want that to look really sharp. And just underneath his beak and the very bottom part of his chest, where that's going to join into like the whiter grey coloured feathers. So yeah, I think I've switched to an even finer brush now, just to really get those details in. Here I'm just adding like a couple of brush strokes that will come out just almost over the edge of that background a tiny bit, just to kind of make him look fluffy. So I think in the end I ended up doing about 4 layers on this chest area, just to get that to look right. Just continually drying it once I'm happy with it, and then deepening those shadows again and again. Adding more texture each time. So the next part, we're going to paint the white grey area of his stomach. And to mix up a base colour for this, I'm going to add a little bit of blue to that dark brown, and I'm going to use plenty of water. We just want this nice and light, so really subtle for that base layer, and we'll build this up. So here I'm just testing that I'm happy with that grey. And by using that same blue that you use for the background, you'll kind of keep all the colours together, everything will match nicely. So we've made a nice cool grey, and just using like a medium brush, I'm just going to start blocking in these shadows. I can just look at my reference to see where the main shadows are and start blocking those in. Again, remembering to follow the direction that the feathers are growing with the brush strokes. So even though this area looks white, or it might look white on your reference picture, if you left this totally blank and just, paper coloured, what happens is when you finish the painting, that area would just look really flat and have no tone to it at all. So even when something is white, it's a good idea to just paint like a really light, subtle colour in there, just to kind of give it a little bit of definition. So here on your reference, if you look, you'll notice that where sort of the side of the bird and its stomach area joins, these feathers sort of change direction and look a little bit more fluffy. So for this bit, I'm looking at my reference all the time and just kind of checking back to see which areas, which direction different parts of the feathers are growing in. Don't worry if you go a little bit too dark on some of these parts, you can always add some white ink at the end just to kind of sharpen up any of these bits and pick out the little white feathers. But yeah, the more water the better for this part. So just like we did on the robin's chest, we're going to just kind of work our way around, keep building up those shadows, those tones. And to do that, we're going to just use a little bit more concentrated paint than the first layer. So in the first layer we used a lot of water, this time we're going to use a little bit less water and more paint. And just keep building that up. If you look really closely at the reference, you'll see that we're up towards his head, where his eye is. The grey is actually a little bit cooler, so I'm adding a little bit more blue just for that little bit. And then as we get down towards the tail, that bottom part down there is a little bit warmer, so I've actually added a little bit of yellow to that grey as well, just to make that a warmer grey. So you can use a little bit of that light grey just to add the first layer of its beak in whilst we're there. We'll build that up and make that darker a little bit later on. So now the next part we're going to do is its wing and the brown sort of on its back. So we want to use a warm brown for this, so if you should have a warm brown in your palette, but if not you can always use a little bit of that dark brown plus some of that cadmium red just to get a nice warm brown as a base for the wing. Add lots of water as well, just for this base colour. And I'm going to work on this just a section at a time, just so I can kind of concentrate on each part, just continually checking that reference. Adding more water when I want that to be a lighter brown, adding more paint when I want that to look a little bit darker or more concentrated. And again, we'll do this base layer and then just build upon this until we're happy with that. The reason why I'm doing this in sections is that if you look at the reference, you can see that it's not just all the same brown. Some parts, like especially right on the top of its back, it looks sort of much darker, and I want that to look more sort of sharp, so I'm adding more paint in those areas, or more layers to those bits. And then the brown part where it joins sort of onto its stomach, where it would be white, that is sort of a much lighter brown, so I'm adding more water for those areas. So just take your time with this. Just keep looking at your reference and keep building up those layers. And so I'm trying to make some parts of this wing look separate. I'm trying to paint it in separate sections. And the reason I'm doing that is because I don't want all the colours to just sort of bleed together and all look like the same brown. I'm trying to sort of do each bit at a time and keep some parts separate. So for this part of the wing, again, I'm just starting off with that light brown, plenty of water. Nice warm sort of brown base colour for this main part of the wing. So I'm painting the top part of the wing first, again just because I don't want that colour to bleed into the underside of the wing and tail that's right next to where we're painting now. So we'll concentrate on this part first and then we'll worry about the tail afterwards. Adding a little bit more of that darker brown now, just to start building that up. I'm continually kind of going back to the areas that I've previously painted once they've sort of started drying a little bit, and I can sharpen those up with the darker brown and add a little bit more texture. So I'm just working my way back through all those sections that I've already painted using a darker brown just to kind of give that bit more contrast and sharpen those areas up. And again, I'm always thinking about the direction of the brush stroke in relation to the direction that the feathers are growing. So now I'm going to think about painting these longer feathers on the main part of its wing. So now that area is already dry, that base layer is dry, I'm just using this fine brush and a slightly darker brown this time, and just really carefully painting these long lines. You see that I'm using my little finger as almost a rest on the page, just so I can have a really steady hand whilst we paint these longer lines. And again, this is just, one of the base layers for this colour. Once that's dry, we'll use an even finer brush and kind of sharpen those long lines even further. See how when I want a darker brown, I'm just adding a little bit of that dark blue to it first. And again, once that top area is dry, just looking back, going back, just sharpening up little bits of it even further. So again, now that area of the wing is pretty dry, I'm just going in with more dark brown, and I'm just kind of making the tip of that wing look a little bit darker. If you notice, it's sort of lighter at the base of the wing and then darker right at the tip. So I'm just going to dry that wing area so I can paint these these longer lines with the feathers in, and I've switched to a really fine detail brush. And to make the brown really dark for this part, just so it stands out, I've added quite a lot of dark blue to that dark brown. And this is what we'll use to kind of paint those final layers and those final lines in. I'm going to use this dark brown colour as well to start painting that underside of the wing where the tail starts to grow from. And I want that to be like the darkest part of the painting really, so yeah, adding lots of that dark blue to the dark brown to make that colour really deep. You can see it's almost quite a sharp edge under that wing there, where the tail is in shadow. And we'll use that same brown just to paint these long feather detail lines in that wing. So again, I'm just using that really dark brown and this really fine brush just to deepen those shadows even more, and they do want to be really dark because they're obviously the darkest part of our painting, and we want to make that wing look sort of really sharp, a really sharp edge around that wing, just by painting that underside of the tail even darker. So for the main part of the tail, we'll paint it this base colour, this warm brown. So you can add a little bit of cadmium red to the brown to make that a little bit warmer. So remember to keep looking at your reference, because if you look there at the tail, it's not all brown, there is like a little patch of white fluffy feathers there. So remember just to leave that bit blank. So I'm sort of painting around the shape of these tail feathers, just to kind of sharpen up the tips of those. Again, if you did it all the same brown, it just wouldn't, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference from the feathers from each other. So yeah, just painting that sort of sectionally. That same brown that we've just used on the tail, you can also use that just to kind of paint in the base colour for his legs as well, whilst you've got that fine brush. I'm going to use that same shade of brown as well, just to put the base colour in the eye. And now that tail section's dried a little bit, we can go in and sharpen that even further. Again, just painting round the tips of those tail feathers, just to kind of sharpen those up and make them look separate from each other. So I'm just constantly going back and looking at any areas that want to be a little bit darker. Now those layers have dried, you can just go ahead and make those a little bit darker. I'm going to add a little bit of shadow to the underside of his legs and his little toes. I'm just going to use a slightly darker brown than the base brown that we used on his legs, and just whilst you've got that really fine brush, you can use that as well. Yeah, just make sure that you're painting these shadows to the underside of the legs and claws. Try and leave the top side kind of in highlight. Don't paint the whole thing's brown, or it'll just look all the same colour. Just try and pick out the shadow areas on the underneath. So now I'm pretty happy with all the brown areas on the wing and the back and his legs, so I've just picked up a little bit of that dark grey again from my palette, and I'm just going to go back to the stomach area and sharpen up some of those shadows, make those a little bit deeper. Sometimes as you progress in the painting and you might realise that some areas are looking just a little bit weaker or too flat, and that just means that there's not enough contrast there, so you can always just go back and add another layer of that colour just to deepen that a little bit. This is the same grey that I'm going to use on his beak, just to add another layer to that. So I've just mixed a brown for this branch in the palette. I'm just going to use a larger brush to apply this to the whole branch. Just be careful not to go over the claws or legs that we've just painted earlier. And again, you don't have to worry about trying to avoid those parts that are meant to look like snow, because you've already put the masking fluid on there, so that will protect those parts. And so I'm pretty much just applying this base brown colour to the whole branch, and then once we've got that on, I'll add a darker brown, especially to the underside area of the branch where it would be in shadow. And again, to make this brown darker, I'm just adding more of that dark blue colour to it. See how that looks a much deeper brown now I've added the blue. And I'm just using this colour on the very bottom part of the branch, on the underneath of it, just to give that a nice sharp edge and to make it look like it's in shadow. So I've just switched back to the fine brush again, and I've just picked up a little bit more of that grey colour. I've just made it a little bit darker this time, so again adding some dark brown or dark blue, whichever colour you need to make that grey look a little bit darker. And now that that first layer on the beak's dry, I can just go in there and just darken that up. Also adding another layer to the eye as well to make that look darker. So we're almost there now with the main part of the painting, so what I'd normally do at this point is just have a good look at the reference, just look at your painting and just kind of check if there's any areas that need to look a bit darker. This is the time now to go and do those. I'm just adding a little bit of a shadow underneath where the snow is on the branch, using that darker brown. So before you remove that masking fluid, just make sure that your painting is totally dry. We don't want to smudge anything that we've just painted. And to remove it, you're just going to gently rub that away with your finger and it should come off. And these areas should look nice and crispy and white and not have any paint on at all. So now you've removed that masking fluid, I'm just going to use a little black fine liner pen, just a really fine one, and just sort of sharpen up any little details that might need sharpening, so especially around the eye, maybe the line on the beak, these little claws, yeah, just look at all those areas. I'm just defining his claws and his legs a little bit with this fine liner pen. With it being so small, such a small area, obviously it's quite difficult to paint even with that really fine brush, so it's nice just to use that fine liner just to sharpen up those details there. Once you've finished with the fine liner, we can do the fun bit, which is all the little white highlights. I'm just using a white gel fine liner pen here just to pick out little details in his eye, a little shine on his beak. Add a few white lines into the feathers there just to make it look extra fluffy. I'm also going to add some little spots of white in front of the robin, just so that does look like some snowflakes kind of falling down in front of him. And you can add a few more of those to the background as well if you wanted it to look extra snowy. I'm even going to put a little bit of a white highlight just along the edge of the bird's back, around his head, maybe around the edge of the branch as well, just to kind of sharpen everything up. Okay, we're pretty much finished, so you can go ahead and remove the masking tape from the edges. So I forgot to do this earlier, but yeah, I was going to add a little bit of shadow to that snow that's on the branch. So to do that, I'm just using a really, really light bluey grey colour, so add lots and lots of water to this, and just add a little bit of that on the underside of that snow, and then we're done. So thank you so much for watching my video. I hope you've enjoyed painting this robin with me. See you next time.